Welcome to Metaviews from Metaview Consulting.
Welcome to this Metaview, and I'm delighted today to be talking to Dr. Helen Macpherson, who is a Senior Research Fellow at Deakin University. She conducts research on brain aging, dementia prevention, using a range of methodologies, which I hope we'll be able to talk about. So I think maybe just as a first question, Helen, I'd like to ask you to just say a little bit about your academic career to date and you know, why this particular area of research interested you in the first place.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. It's always nice to have an opportunity to talk about my research, which I'm very passionate about. So I started out at Swinburne, and my initial studies were looking at age-related changes in brain function. And then I went on to do a PhD looking at neurocognitive effects of multivitamins in older women. And so that was a clinical trial that used some brain imaging techniques as well. And after that, I did a postdoc with yourself and Andrew Papingas, and I've continued to work with you both over the years. And so during my postdoc at Swinburne, I was able to get exposure and be part of a whole lot of different clinical trials looking at mostly dietary supplements and diet for cognitive function and mood as well. And then I got a fellowship to go to Deakin University, to the Institute for Physical Activity and Nutrition, where I wanted to start looking at cognitive effects of exercise as well, and looking at combination of, nutritional diet interventions with exercise and how that impact cognition.
Okay, thank you. And I guess, as you say, you kind of moved from looking at the effects of individual nutrients, multivitamins in particular, through, I guess, to more whole dietary and lifestyle interventions, dietary and exercise. I guess the latter are a little bit harder to specify in some ways. So I wondered what you think are the relative merits of those two approaches.
I guess in terms of looking at like individual nutrients or dietary supplements such as multivitamins, the main merit is the clinical trials are much easier to run. So that's definitely an advantage. But in terms of the benefit there, I think it really does depend on people's nutrient status, so where they're starting out at baseline. So I definitely think that there is a place for micronutrient supplementation in terms of correcting deficiencies, and that may in turn impact cognition. But I think one of the challenges with that area is that changing something small, like one type of nutrient or like a multivitamin that has low levels of lots of different nutrients, is not likely to have a huge effect on cognition. And it's not necessarily going to have the same impact as more multifaceted or multi-targeted approaches, because there are actually lots of health risk factors for cognitive decline and for dementia, and nutrition is just one of them. So yeah, I definitely would say that my work has kind of indicated that if there's no deficiency kind of in place, that it's harder to see any sort of cognitive effects with those type of interventions. Yeah. And we've sort of moved away from that because that one size fits all sort of approach, I guess it wasn't giving the kind of effects that we were hoping to see. Whereas looking at like whole diet change and exercise, that can actually impact a range of risk factors for cognitive decline. It can, impact things like cardiovascular health and glucose regulation. And so there's, I guess, more mechanisms that can be improved through those types of interventions, as opposed to something I'd say smaller, like, one type of nutrient or supplement.
No, that's really interesting. I think there's also this emerging evidence that it's not just redressing a deficiency as well. you kind of need, quite often, the effects of these individual nutrients or collections of nutrients are very heavily interdependent. So I'm thinking about, for example, David Smith's recent work showing that perhaps, for a B vitamin to have an effect, you need to have omega-3s there as well, and vice versa. So that is interesting. You're an NHMRC and ARC fellow, which I think is quite unusual. And I know, looking at your CV, which is very impressive, it reflects those two aspects, I think. For people who don't know the Australian funding landscape, we have really only two funding bodies: the NHMRC, which funds health-related and medical research, and then the ARC, which looks more at mechanisms and that sort of less applied research, I guess. One really striking aspect of your work is the range of methodologies you've really got hold of and used and applied very well, from clinical trials through to systematic reviews, meta-analyses, biomarker measurement, and particularly, I think, very sophisticated neuroimaging methodologies. First of all, how easy is it to keep on top of these? And can you talk about the kind of relative merits of these?
Yeah, so sometimes I feel a little bit like a jack of all trades, but I really feel like I've sort of learned about different methodologies to answer specific questions. So rather than spending my career becoming an expert in one technique, such as brain imaging, I've done a couple of studies and then sort of moved on to other techniques. But for me, it was really key to first have a good understanding of neurocognitive aging. So if we're going to intervene or try and enhance cognition, really need to understand how it declines. And all of my research really comes from this. So using brain imaging methodologies enable me to really drill down, understand how the function of brain regions and networks change with age, and understand some of the models that describe these changes. And then therefore, what are the best targets to improve cognition? But then at the same time, to answer bigger questions, I think you need a good grasp on larger data sets, population data sets, and meta-analyses. So I sort of feel like, for me, it makes sense to be focusing both on more the mechanistic work and then at the same time looking at data across bigger populations. And then at the same time, looking at interventions as well, because I feel like it all comes in together. And my focus has always been on some of these bigger questions around, can we prevent dementia? When should we be doing this? How should we be doing this? And what's the role of lifestyle? And so for me, it always comes back to the brain. How do we improve brain health? How do we, what are the cognitive outcomes that we're using in these studies actually measuring? And, are the interventions that we're doing targeted enough to improve those outcomes? So, yeah, I guess it really is, for me, like which methodology best fits with the research question, and just involves learning about lots of different things. And it's so fascinating, but I do feel like the time I spent working on different imaging techniques and down with participants in the MRI scanner and learning from, the radiographer, all of the ins and outs as well, has really given me a proper appreciation for the data. And I think that's also what it comes back to, is understanding what you're measuring. And definitely for interventions, if you're going to improve something, you've got to understand what you're measuring.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that kind of brings me on to my next question, which is about translation, understanding what we're measuring and what effect that might have in the real world. And quite often we look at these very specific cognitive tests where you might be talking about millisecond changes in some fairly esoteric cognitive test. It's really important, I think, as you say, to be able to translate that and give that some sort of meaning. I think there's another aspect of translation as well, which is how we can apply these data to really help people in the real world. And I know that that's something that you've been involved with. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of funny because when we talk about translation at the moment, it's very embedded in what our funding schemes think is translation. And by that degree, it would be like rolling out findings from a clinical trial in the community. So from that perspective, I feel like a bit of a failure when it comes to translation. But we wouldn't want to just restrict ourselves to what funding bodies think is important. So I guess really for my work, yeah, like you said, when we're looking at, for instance, cognitive tests, and they can be a bit obscure. What does this really mean? You know, one of the things we've always tried to do is to quantify the changes. So if we see an improvement of X, you know, what does this mean in terms of years recovered of cognitive function? Because essentially any interventions that we're doing around delaying cognitive impairment or dementia, I mean, that's the goal, isn't it? You know, to ultimately find an intervention that slows the onset or rate of dementia. So in terms of the translation side of things, a lot of my work has kind of been outside of necessarily my specific research project findings and more using like the data I have to answer some of the bigger questions around dementia prevention. And that's something I've, you know, really worked on in terms of media work and as well community presentations. There's a lot of stigma around dementia, so just trying to normalize talking about dementia, trying to normalize you know, talking about risk factors for dementia, and even get education out to people that there are things that people can do around dementia, as we know that around 40% of dementia risk is modifiable. So that's something that we always take opportunity to try and get the word out, even now. And then the other element to translation in my work has been through forming the dementia prevention special interest group. So in 2016, I had the opportunity through Australian Dementia Forum conference to lead a roundtable conversation around dementia prevention. And from then I was able to form a special interest group with researchers, experts around Australia, all with a common goal to prevent dementia. And that's just been a terrific experience to get like-minded people together. It sort of takes away some of the barriers of, you know, competing research areas or universities, because it's really about a common goal of working out how to prevent dementia and getting messages out to people. So last year we wrote a paper for the Medical Journal of Australia where we basically put out a call to action around dementia prevention and outlined 8 steps. And really the aim of that paper is to, I guess, develop a system where, or a health system that promotes dementia prevention and has a pathway for people to improve their health and give people the best chance that they can through access to services, through public health messaging, and all of those types of things.
Fantastic. And I hope we'll be able to put a link to that paper somewhere, sort of in either in this video or you know, in a sidebar somewhere. That's such important work, and yeah, that's really good. I guess one other aspect of translation, which we're both involved with, is the Medwalk trial. It's not quite at that level of translation, but it's something that we're both very passionate about, I know. Perhaps you'd just like to talk a little bit about that and your involvement, because it kind of falls into both of the camps of research that you're interested in with the exercise element.
Yeah, so this is a project. It was a few years in the making, work with yourself and led by Andrew Papingas at Swinburne University, looking at an intervention for cognitive function in older people who are community dwelling, looking at a combined Mediterranean diet and walking program with a really nice behaviour change element embedded in the trial, because we know that's really key. And it's sort of taking some of the, I guess, the more so population data that shows that there are benefits of the Mediterranean diet for cognition in older people, plus evidence from lots of clinical trials that show benefits of exercise, including walking, and rolling it out on a larger scale in an Australian trial. So it's currently underway, and we're aiming to get around 350 participants in Victoria and South Australia to get involved. It's a 2-year trial overall, and over that time we'll be able to look at rates of cognitive change. The actual intervention goes for a shorter period of time, but we'll be looking at the longer follow-ups as well. So we're hoping that this will provide some really important Australian data that will really contribute to international efforts around dementia prevention.
And I think one aspect of that is it's quite surprising that it is the first trial to restrict itself just to a dietary change with exercise. I think so. There have been other trials which are multimodal and others that have specifically looked at exercise or Mediterranean diet, but none that have just done that very, just that combination within this specific population. So yeah, it's a great thing to be involved in, I think, for both of us. I mean, this is such a sort of far-reaching set of studies that you've been involved with and led. The other one I know from reading some of the stuff that you've put out in the last sort of year or so is the work you've done on the UK Biobank, which is really impressive. Could you just talk us through that?
Yeah, so we're doing some work with the UK Biobank, which is an amazing resource. Over 500,000 people from the UK who have undergone a whole range of health measures, and part of that, a subset, have had MRI brain imaging. So we got a grant within Deakin, led by my colleague Catherine Milty, to look at a couple of different outcomes, looking at different health impacts of different dietary patterns. So we're looking at cognition and brain volume. And our focus is on middle-aged people because we're wanting to look, now understanding that dementia has a long prodromal period, that midlife is a really important time for risk factors. But one of the things that's often missing in formal risk factor models is actual diet. So we're hoping that some of this data will really help to put that on the map. So we've done a study looking at 19,000 people who underwent dietary assessments and brain imaging as a part of the Biobank study. And we looked at 3 different diet patterns and the relationships between brain volume in middle-aged people, so people aged 40 to 65. Most of the work that's looked at diet and brain volume has actually focused on older people, so there hasn't been just a midlife sample like this before. So we looked at the Mediterranean diet, so same as the Medwalk study. We also looked at a measure of diet that lines up with UK dietary guidelines, and also a measure of diet that looks at dietary variety. So we're interested in looking at these 3 dietary patterns because outside of the cognitive or dementia literature, these dietary patterns have been linked to lots of different health indices. So things like diabetes, heart disease, mortality, etc. And so we've just submitted this study to a journal. So fingers crossed it's published soon. But basically we did find that at midlife that there was association between these dietary patterns and brain volume, which is good to know that, you know, even potentially 20 years before people go on to get dementia, we can actually see that there are important role of diet in terms of brain health in midlife. And interesting the med diet wasn't, I guess, the strongest predictor or the predictor of the most number of brain volume variables. It was actually the more linking up with the dietary guidelines. So that was an interesting finding. And the other thing that we found that was quite interesting was that the relationships were largely driven by men. We do know that during midlife, men have more prevalent dementia risk factors, things like diabetes, etc., more prevalent in men. So it could be sort of to do with that. But that's also an interesting question, given that, you know, more women go on to get dementia. So sort of untangling some of these sex effects as well.
That's really fascinating. And will there be an opportunity to follow up the same individuals?
So we've submitted an application to the NHMRC for some funding to look at diet and how that links to later dementia onset, because the UK data set is a longitudinal data set. So these people will continue to be followed for the rest of their lives. We're also going to look at how other patterns of lifestyle factors are linked to later dementia onset. We haven't been able to look at that yet because of the age of the UK Biobank sample. In a couple of years' time, more people will have reached, you know, beyond 70, and there'll be more cases of dementia to look at. But at the moment, there was sort of a limited number to look at that.
Helen, it's been a really fascinating conversation about some really important work. I guess my final question to you would just be around what do you see as the next big step or frontier in this area of research?
I guess what we haven't really been able to look at before, knowing that we have a long prodromal period for dementia, is, you know, some of the biomarkers earlier on. And I think really understanding dementia risk profiles before the onset of clinical symptoms is going to be really important. With new amyloid and tau blood biomarkers, so these are going to be available for research on a much larger scale in coming years, we'll be able to identify people with pathology earlier without needing to send people for a PET scan or a lumbar puncture. And then hopefully, you know, we can marry up the appropriate intervention, whether that's drug therapy or lifestyle intervention based on, you know, some of these biomarkers. And we also think that understanding risk factor profiles during midlife might be useful as a surrogate marker. And that comes back to the research that, you know, we've just put in a grant for. And, you know, there's been some nice advances that link clinical symptoms to brain neurodegeneration to understand new dementia subtypes. There are dementia risk scores that we can look at in midlife, but we think that maybe using the big data sets like the UK Biobank, in coming years, we might be able to look at which patterns of risk factors predict dementia subtypes, which will be informative for interventions long before we even see any pathology. So using the risk factors rather than, you know, the biomarkers of pathology. So I think that could be a really promising area.
That's really fascinating. And do you think that the risk factors could be different across different individuals, even for the same type of kind of cognitive phenotype, if you like, in terms of dementia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we just don't know yet. It would be really nice if we could actually work out these nice profiles that match up to, you know, set trajectories of cognitive impairment or pathology subtypes. That would be great. But, you know, we really don't know at this stage, but we do think that that might be important, like which risk factors coincide and, yeah, how that impacts later cognitive function.
Well, thank you. I've got a feeling that we can carry on this conversation for hours, but I think I'm going to have to bring things to a close. Can you just say, you know, I think you've really spoken to a lot of the things that Metave's very heavily involved in. One of our reasons for being is particularly the translational element. So that's been really, really useful. Thank you. And if people want to find you online, follow you on Twitter, etc., what should they look for?
So my Twitter handle is Dr. Helen _Mac. So you can look me up on Twitter there, or you can search Google Scholar, just my name, Helen Macpherson. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Helen, Dr. Helen Macpherson, thank you very much for this Metaview. Thank you.
Thank you for your attention. For more information, visit metavate.consulting.